Philippines has called out China. China's response is clearly not good. CCP has a nasty habit of stretching its borders and claiming territories that do not belong to it. Unfortunately, it has made a big mistake by choosing the Philippines as a victim this time around. In the past couple of weeks, tensions have been really high in the South China Sea as Philippine and Chinese Coast Guard ships are reporting multiple collisions in the region.
Tensions are rising in one of the most hotly contested regions on the planet.
Chinese and Philippines vessels collided during a confrontation in the South China Sea.
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 Sira ang plan nila. Ang camera.
First, real quick, we need your help. CCP bots are fighting hard against this type of content and we need your help to fight them off. Please leave a quick like on this video to help us push against the YouTube algorithm so we can continue to bring you informative content. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get into it. On the 19th of August, several Chinese and Philippine vessels collided near the Sabina Shoal, with the Chinese Coast Guard claiming that the Philippine vessel deliberately collided with them. The shoal, which has been claimed by China as Jianbin Jiao and as Escoda Shoal by the Philippines, is located some 75 miles from the Philippines' west coast and 630 miles from China. This incident was followed by a second round of collisions, with both sides once again blaming each other. The Philippines claim that the Chinese Coast Guard vessel 5205 intentionally rammed into the Philippines vessel. On the other hand, the Chinese claim that the Philippine ship was illegally stranded at the shoal and deliberately rammed into them. Another incident also occurred on the 26th of August, where the Philippines claimed that 40 Chinese ships prevented 2 of their boats from conducting a humanitarian mission to restock the Teresa Magbuana, a Philippine Coast Guard ship deployed months earlier to the shoal. Again, China continued with its rehearsed defense that its actions on the sea have been professional and appropriate. The running theory by the Philippines is that China is attempting to reclaim land at Sabina Shoal, with reports that Beijing is using that raw material to expand the shoal. Of course, China has denied this, stating that the claims are groundless and unscientific. Although these are the most recent incidents, China and the Philippines have been at it since the beginning of the year. We will start with a small incident in January where a Filipino fishing boat captain claimed the Chinese Coast Guard drove him away from Scarborough Shoal and forced him to dump his catch into the sea. The Scarborough Shoal is a triangular reef formation that is a source of contention because of its rich waters and marine resources. It has been the site of a lot of Manila-Beijing disputes in the past couple of months, and in May, 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen broke through the blockade of Chinese vessels and reached the shoal. Back at the Second Thomas Shoal in March, Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard vessels collided, injuring 4 Filipino crew members. Things got more dangerous in April this year when a Chinese Coast Guard ship fired water cannons at 2 Philippine patrol vessels near the Scarborough Shoal, which could soon overtake the Second Thomas Shoal as the two nations' biggest shoal fight. Again, in June this year, a Chinese Coast Guard rammed a Filipino resupply boat. The Chinese sailors were brandishing makeshift spears, which cost a Filipino soldier one of his fingers. The Philippine military chief, General Romeo Bronner, stated that they were outnumbered and the Filipino crew had been unarmed and had fought with their bare hands. In response to these allegations, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian said that Manila's comments on the clash were bogus and that the Philippines was to blame. According to them, Filipino boats had been ramming into Chinese vessels. Beijing wants us to believe that their Coast Guard has been professional and restrained during the confrontation and that no direct measures were taken against Filipino personnel. As we can see throughout this year, the interactions have moved from microaggressions to full-on fights. With fights persisting from the Scarborough Shoal, the Second Thomas Shoal, and the Sabina Shoal, it is clear that the Philippines and China are not seeing eye to eye in the South China Sea. There has always been tension between the two nations, but the fights for the shoals intensified in June last year when Chinese sailors attacked Filipino sailors with machetes and hammers while they were on their way to resupply their soldiers stationed on a warship. Footage has been released by the Filipino military showing Chinese Coast Guard officers brandishing an axe and other bladed or pointed tools at the Filipino soldiers and slashing their rubber boats.
Medyo.
Hey! Hey! Pagputol ng tali!
China and the Philippines have been fighting a lot in the South China Sea, 9 times just in August alone. But you might not have seen that news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitics news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. Both sides blamed each other for the confrontation, but knowing China, this was definitely one of their acts of aggression. We would think that by now, China would have managed to win this border dispute. China has been known to bully smaller nations into a corner, but surprisingly, the Philippines has been giving it a run for its money. After the incident in June this year, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. stated, "We will never be intimidated or oppressed by anyone." He has pledged to continue to exercise our freedoms and rights in support of our national interest in accordance with international law. This lets us know that these disputes are probably going to be going on for a very long time. Now, if you have been a loyal subscriber for a while, you will know that this is not the first time that China has come head-to-head with the Philippines in this area. We have discussed the most recent aggressions, but now I want to explain why the South China Sea is such a hot zone for disputes. Later on, we will also shed light on how the USA is tangled up in all of this. The South China Sea is a sea in the western Pacific Ocean that is about 3.5 million square kilometers. Its positioning is the source of contention, as it is right in the middle of these 6 nations. The sea is south of China and Taiwan, between Vietnam and the Philippines, and north of Brunei and Malaysia. It holds 2 groups of islands, the Spratly Islands in the south and the Paracel Islands in the north. As you can expect, the dispute is territorial as all 6 countries claim a part of the sea and the islands within it. China's claim of the islands is the largest, demarcating it by the so-called 9-dash line. These lines are based on a 1936 map by Chinese cartographer Bai Meichu. The line comprises 9 dashes that extend hundreds of miles south and east from its most southerly province of Hainan. China also claims that the territory has been part of it for centuries, including the Paracel and Spratly Island chains. Outside of the territorial issues with the islands, there are other things that have made the South China Sea worth the fight. The South China Sea is one of the busiest waterways for global trade, with ships carrying an estimated 30% of global crude oil through it. What is even more interesting is that its seabed is believed to hold huge oil and gas reserves. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the sea is estimated to have 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. It is also home to rich fishing grounds, and more than half of the world's fishing vessels operate in this area. The Paracels and the Spratlys have been rumored to have reserves of natural resources around them. Specifically for China, the South China Sea is its 2nd most used sea lane in the world after the Dover Strait, and 60% of its total trade and 80% of its oil imports transit through the region. To add to its appeal, on the tourism front, the islands of the South China Sea have a lot to offer. Beach resorts like the Philippines Boracay have some stunning beaches and beautiful sunsets. The cruise tourism market is also booming, with ships operating from China, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines going into the sea. Having control of more islands in the region means being able to take a slice out of the tourism pie. Now, while all of these things make the South China Sea a worthy territory, what is probably fueling the fire is the fact that the sea is such a strategic military location. Because the sea is close to so many countries, many of them are looking to drop military bases and installations around islands and shoals. China has been camouflaging military ships on the sea, claiming that they are just fishing boats. Beijing's aim is for the ships to provide backup to the China Coast Guard and maintain a constant presence in remote waters. In addition to its military buildup, China has already built military bases on the Spratly Reefs while also flying its fighter jets above the sea. Now that we have looked at the reason for the numerous fights, let us trace out some of the earlier contentions for the South China Sea. China's aggression in the region and its claims have been a problem as each of the 6 countries occupies at least one of the islands. As the CCP has become more militarized in its activities in the sea, Vietnam and the Philippines have been the 2 nations that have given China the most grief about its claims. In the 1900s, China and Vietnam fought for the region, with the 2 fighting for the Spratly and Paracel Islands. In 1974, China seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam, killing more than 65 Vietnamese soldiers in the process. In 2014, China moved an oil rig into Vietnamese waters, sparking massive protests in Vietnam. What's worse is China has been known to arrest foreign fishermen and sailors in waters they consider to be their own. China's fights with Vietnam are few and spread out, but Manila and Beijing have been at each other's throats consistently throughout the years. In the early 2000s, the Philippines and China were at it, with things intensifying in 2013. Things got so bad that the Philippines filed a case against China at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. After a lot of back and forth, the Philippines Foreign Minister Albert Del Rosario stated that the Philippines has exhausted almost all political and diplomatic avenues for a peaceful negotiated settlement of its maritime dispute with China. The Philippines wanted the court to rule on what territorial claims it was owed in the South China Sea and to determine if China had infringed on its territorial rights through China's construction and fishing activities. Since China is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Philippines hoped that they could be held accountable. China refused to take part in the case, claiming that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was beyond its jurisdiction. On July 12, 2016, the arbitral tribunal adjudicating the case ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines, determining that major elements of China's claim, including its 9-dash line, recent land reclamation activities, and other activities in Philippine waters, were unlawful. As you saw earlier in our discussion, the Second Thomas Shoal has been the main center of dispute between China and the Philippines. The shoal is a reef that is about 124 miles from Palawan, Philippines, but more than 621 miles from China. It has been widely considered to belong to the Philippines because of how close it is to it. Unfortunately, China does not agree with this, despite the ruling by the International Tribunal that China had no legal rights to the shoal, which is in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Philippines have had a military presence on the shoal since 1999, and they have no plans of moving anytime soon. The BRP Sierra Madre has been docked on it and has served as a base for some of its troops for many years. Despite this, China has been fighting for the tiny shoal, and many believe it is because its strategic location would be perfect for a naval base. Some even say that it could also be because the area has rich oil and gas reserves, but that is yet to be proved. This is all so messy, but now we are going to take a detour to discuss U.S. involvement in the matter. Although the U.S. has no territorial claim in the South China Sea, they have been performing freedom of navigation exercises around the area. These are basically naval operations conducted by countries to demonstrate their rights to navigate through international waters. This is an international law right that is stated in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. One of the reasons behind this right is to challenge excessive maritime claims by asserting military presence and capabilities. The U.S. has been carrying out these exercises in the South China Sea as a way of telling China to pipe down and show its influence. The U.S. amped up its exercises under the Trump administration, and they have been sailing their vessels near or around features claimed by China. Washington's actions have frustrated Beijing, and in 2021, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, "It is the United States which has actually militarized the area and threatened freedom of navigation." The country, over 8,300 miles from the South China Sea, has built several military bases with offensive weapons around the area and frequently sent aircraft carriers and strategic bombers throughout the year. One of the major reasons that the U.S. has gotten involved in this maritime dispute is that it has a stake in the sea remaining open. With the freedom of the seas principle, under maritime law, the U.S. can enjoy movement in trade and for its military pursuits. If China gets to claim the South China Sea as its territory, the U.S. and many other nations will not be able to use the waterway freely. The Philippines is also an ally of the U.S., so their involvement in the area is also to maintain stability. They have a mutual defense treaty with the U.S., which means that if the contention in the South China Sea turns to war, the U.S. would be obliged to step in. We also need to look at the fact that despite China's feelings that the U.S. is overly involved, the U.S. has really been trying to stay neutral, veering Kimberly Nowens, an executive director for Asia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, states that responding to coercive actions in the gray zone is difficult precisely because the lines between peace and conflict are blurred. What has ensured that the U.S. has kept its antics to a minimum is the fact that it has also been trying to reduce its tension with China. President Biden has made it clear that he seeks only to have friendly competition with China and that America is looking to consolidate a friendship with China. This means that the U.S. is towing a delicate line, and the Philippines will probably have to keep fighting its own battles in the region. As the fights between the two nations escalate at an alarming rate, we need to start talking about what could happen next. Things could escalate further, as there are reports that Beijing wants to implement a new policy that would authorize the Chinese Coast Guard to detain foreigners crossing into waters claimed by China. This is a direct violation of international law, and it could see more than just the Philippines going head-to-head with China. In the meantime, the Philippines is not lying idle. Manila is working on deepening its alliance with Washington, and the two countries have carried out military drills together. This also took place on an island chain in the northern Philippines with a practice launch of an anti-ship cruise missile that sunk a decommissioned ship. While the U.S. has been neutral till this point, a strengthening of the alliance could be a sign that it may be willing to act with the Philippines in the near future. The Philippines has been carrying out a number of security drills and signing agreements with other countries like Australia and Japan. Currently, Japan and the Philippines are discussing a reciprocal troop access agreement, and the Philippines and Australia have upgraded their cooperation in maritime security. The Philippines is doing a lot of leveling up on the military front, giving China a reason to be afraid. Currently, it is a waiting game, and the next act of aggression will show us the intentions of the two nations. At present, Manila continues to record each incident and publicize it for the world to see. By showing us who China really is, the Philippines is preparing for the time that it actually does hit back. When it finally pushes China out with military force, the international community will be able to understand what led to that point. The United States stands with our Philippine allies. These are the words of Ned Price, the U.S. State Department spokesperson. He further went on to say that China's recent activity in the South China Sea, one of the world's most contested regions, was reckless. His exact words were, "Dangerous operational behavior directly threatens regional peace and stability, infringes upon freedom of navigation in the South China Sea as guaranteed under international law, and undermines the rules-based international order." The bottom line is, the United States is ready to throw its full military weight into South China Sea disputes. What spurred this action, you ask? This.
Have another which is in front of us and it's blocking us off.
Yes, China is antagonizing yet another nation because of the South China Sea. We will explore China and the Philippines' relationship and how that is proving to be an area of tension that might be the friction point that leads us to an undesired and unwanted globe-wrecking, catastrophic war. No, I'm not exaggerating. These conflicts might spiral into something horrific. Before we do that, do take a second to support my war on the YouTube algorithm by pressing the like button on this video. Your support in every single video I post is crucial, and I can never thank you enough. Okay, back to the basics. To better understand the recent events, we have to understand the relations between the two nations. China and the Philippines haven't exactly had the smoothest, nicest relationship so far as international relations are concerned. By virtue of them laying particular claims in the South China Sea, they have come at loggerheads several times. If you ask the Philippines, they will tell you that all this maritime space is theirs and is in their jurisdiction. If you ask China, they will tell you that all this is their maritime space. So far as Beijing is involved, all the waters within its 9-dash line, a boundary that extends hundreds of miles to the south and east of its island province of Hainan, are China's. One small problem though, the boundary that China claims covers nearly the entire sea. You can see now how these nations were destined to clash. The Philippines is not alone in this dispute with China. Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam all have ongoing conflicts with China too, revolving around the very same concept. So far as they are involved, China is the big bully exerting its influence and power on their sovereign waters. What makes the Philippines different is that the nation actually took some drastic measures over its claim. If you know only one thing about the Philippines, it's that they never take anything lying down. Tired of unsuccessful diplomatic talks with Beijing, Manila took its fight to the Hague-based Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2013, seeking a definitive ruling. Yes, the Philippines took China to court. China, however, refused to participate in the case, claiming that it was not in their interest to do so, since the verdict was clear. This did not stop The Hague from reaching a verdict, though, and they did rule in the Philippines' favor, an action that must have stopped all of China's intrusion into the Philippines' territory. Unfortunately, or rather predictably, China has chosen to ignore that ruling and has only further escalated the tensions in the region by becoming more aggressive and bold. It really feels like a "what can you do to me" type of aggression, considering both China's economic and military might. The fact that China is a heavyweight has essentially allowed them to ignore The Hague's ruling and do things like this. This is where the recent attack against the Philippine vessel also comes into play. Despite high-level delegates from both nations having talks and agreements this year regarding peace in the South China Sea, China seems to have thrown all the agreements out the window. Last month, on one of their resupply missions to supply the troops at the Yungjin Shoal, the Philippine Coast Guard was met with what can be called Chinese resistance on their way there. According to the Philippine Coast Guard, the boat that was carrying the supplies was targeted with a military-grade laser that temporarily blinded the crew. Yes, the Philippines Coast Guard was targeted by a Chinese laser in a bid to deter them from their destinations. They even complained that the Chinese ships made dangerous maneuvers against them. This is all clearly hostile action. Let me add further context to this resupply journey. The place the Philippine ship was going to, also called Second Thomas Shoal, lies about 105 nautical miles northwest of the Philippine province of Palawan in the disputed Spratly Islands. This particular shoal serves as a home to a small group of Philippine soldiers living on board a rusting World War II-era ship known as the Sierra Madre. This ship was deliberately grounded there in 1999 to underline the country's claim of sovereignty, and a contingent of troops now stays there. For the Chinese Navy to point lasers against a Philippine ship that is going to resupply its own troops is just plain interference in internal issues. It is no wonder why Teresita Daza, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, said in a statement, "The Philippines has the prerogative to conduct legitimate activities within its exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. China does not have law enforcement rights or powers in and around Yungjin Shoal or any part of the Philippine EEZ." She went on to highlight the absurdity of that hostile action in light of the January Maritime Peace meeting held between the two nations. She said, "These acts of aggression by China are disturbing and disappointing, as it closely follows the state visit to China of President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. in early January, during which he and Chinese President Xi Jinping agreed to manage maritime differences through diplomacy and dialogue, without resorting to force and intimidation." This vocalization of concern is part of what the Philippines has decided to do in what seems like a new strategy meant to garner international support by exposing China. The Philippine Coast Guard particularly has launched a strategy of publicizing aggressive actions by China in the disputed South China Sea. By publicizing its own side of the matter, it then counters Chinese propaganda by revealing the light of the matter. A Coast Guard Commodore said, "I'd like to emphasize that the best way to address Chinese gray zone activities in the West Philippine Sea is to expose it." This recent transparency policy has resulted in increased international condemnation of Beijing, something that carries weight on a global scale. When the Philippine Coast Guard protested and released a video of the laser incident, it raised heavy red flags and sparked alarm in the Philippines, the United States, and several countries. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the president of the Philippines, took action by summoning China's ambassador to Manila. He later said the Philippine military has shifted its focus. From once fighting Muslim and communist insurgents and other internal threats, they now focus on external defense amid long-seething South China Sea territorial disputes. The Philippines, under Marcos, has really stepped up its rhetoric to challenge China and simultaneously strengthen its ties with the United States, including plans to hold joint sea patrols. This is a big shift in terms of national direction, and this highlights how seriously the Philippines government is taking this matter. With the US at their side, they become a much larger and more menacing threat. Like any matter, there are two sides to be heard. Beijing was forced to release a statement in light of public outcry, and they did. When asked to explain their position, Chinese officials said the Philippine patrol vessel trespassed into Chinese territory. This means that they still adamantly view that area as being theirs. They went on to say that the Chinese Coast Guard acted professionally and with restraint and used a harmless laser to track the Philippine boat's movement. This is in opposition to what Manila said and released. This is exactly the position that the Philippines wants to be in. Force the Chinese to admit truths or force a public lie. Either way, as the victim of Chinese aggression, Manila wins. It's quite the strategy, if you ask me. Relations between the two countries are unfortunately getting worse, even after the laser incident. The laser incident was just one of several clashes that are bound to keep escalating. To see the full scope of the conflict, a Reuters journalist joined a Philippine routine flight and observed some of those Chinese boats dotted the waters around T2, an island of 400 people. From a bird's eye view, it almost seems like a barricade. It is no wonder that the Philippines accused those vessels, including a Navy ship, of slowly loitering. Of course, China snapped back, claiming that it has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, known in China as the Nansha Islands, its adjacent waters. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning-said even said of the situation in a briefing, "Therefore, it is reasonable and legal for Chinese ships to carry out normal activities in waters under China's jurisdiction." China's response and actions are clear. They are sticking to their argument that it is their jurisdiction. What they are saying is that the South China Sea is theirs, regardless of what The Hague or anyone else says. With the US openly backing the Philippines and planning joint military exercises, what is apparent is that hostilities will continue to rise, and eventually a boiling point will be reached. It has long been thought that the South China Sea will be the point of ignition for a third world war, and seeing these kinds of events unravel, you realize how true that is. One small spark can set into motion an irreversible course of action. With the US pledging an alliance with the Philippines, any war that drags the US in will drag its allies in too. What we are seeing is a live grenade. The world is just counting down now and wondering how long it will take for it to go off. To imagine that a Philippines conflict would be the fuse that sets off all of this is quite a scary thought. I don't like war, but its inevitability is slowly starting to become a reality.